Friends, thank you for being here today. We are gathered to examine a moment in our nation's capital that, while perhaps understated in the frenetic cycle of cable news, represents a seismic shift in the tectonic plates of American political power. It is a moment that requires us to look past the surface noise, the tweets, the rallies, the ephemeral controversies, and focus our attention on the machinery of governance itself. Something fundamental has snapped inside Washington, and for the first time in a presidency defined by its ability to bend the Republican Party to its will, the president finds himself confronting a force he cannot intimidate, a rebellion he cannot quell, and a constitutional reality he can no longer ignore. We are witnessing the breaking of a fever. For years, the prevailing wisdom in the corridors of the Senate and the back rooms of the House has been one of absolute executive dominance. The assumption was that the president's grip on the base was so absolute, his command of the media cycle so total, that no Republican legislator could afford to cross him. But today, we discuss a profound deviation from that norm. A vote is preparing to move through the United States Senate, a body designed by the founders to be the saucer that cools the tea, the deliberative check on executive passion. This vote concerns the War Powers Resolution, a mechanism that strikes at the very heart of a commander-in-chief's authority. And the news is not just that the vote is happening, but that Donald Trump, in private moments of candid frustration, has admitted he does not know how to stop it. Why does this matter? Why does a procedural vote on war powers terrify a president who has weathered investigations, impeachments, and relentless media scrutiny? The answer lies not in the policy itself, but in what the vote symbolizes. It represents the erosion of invincibility. It signals that the calculation of political survival for Senate Republicans has shifted. They are no longer operating solely out of fear of a primary challenge from the right. They are beginning to operate out of a fear of institutional obsolescence and the judgment of history. We are analyzing the real-time collapse of a power structure that relies on the illusion of total control, and what we find underneath is a party struggling to reclaim its soul and its constitutional prerogatives. To truly understand the gravity of this situation, we must first look past the public image and examine the panic and loss of control occurring behind closed doors. To understand the gravity of this situation, one must contrast the public projection of strength with the private reality of anxiety. The hallmark of this administration has been the projection of unassailable confidence, the strongman persona that asserts, "I alone can fix it." Yet, reports emerging from the West House paint a strikingly different portrait. We are told of a president pacing behind closed doors, phone in hand, frantically dialing Republican senators. These are men and women who, for 3 years, have largely fallen in line. But now, the calls are going to voicemail. The cajoling is meeting silence. The threats are landing on deaf ears. This is a power collapse happening in real time. When a president admits to his inner circle that he cannot stop a rebellion within his own party, he is acknowledging a fatal wound to his political authority. This is not a skirmish with the Never Trump faction. Those battles were fought and largely won by the president years ago. This is something far more dangerous to his standing, a structural collapse of his control over the Senate caucus itself. Why is the panic so acute? Because the War Powers Resolution is not merely a slap on the wrist. It is a legal bind. It threatens to limit the president's ability to use the military as a tool of personal or political leverage. For a leader whose entire identity is built on dominance, on the capacity to threaten fire and fury, to utilize the armed forces as an extension of executive will, a legislative check on that power is an existential threat. It strips away the mystery and the menace that the strongman relies upon. If Congress can dictate the terms of engagement, if the Senate can say no to a conflict, then the president is no longer the sole arbiter of national destiny. He becomes what the Constitution intended him to be, a co-equal branch of government constrained by law. For a man accustomed to the unilateral authority of the boardroom, this is a terrifying prospect. I ask you, as observers of history, does this private panic surprise you, or have you sensed this shift in the political winds long before the pundits acknowledged it? I invite you to share your perspective in the comments below. At the center of this revolt stands the catalyst of this moment, the War Powers Resolution and the return of constitutional logic. At the center of this revolt stands an unlikely coalition, spearheaded by figures such as Senator Rand Paul. Senator Paul has long been an isolationist voice in a party often dominated by hawks, but in this moment, his arguments are resonating not just because of their policy implications, but because of their logical clarity. We are seeing a dismantling of the pretexts that have long been used to justify executive overreach. Consider the arguments regarding regime change in Venezuela. The administration, and indeed some traditional hawks, have floated various justifications for potential intervention, ranging from humanitarian concerns to national security threats. But Senator Paul, in public forums and on massive platforms that reach millions of Americans, has systematically deconstructed these rationales. He has asked the uncomfortable questions that the establishment prefers to avoid. When the administration cites drug trafficking or weapon possession by foreign leaders as a casus belli, a justification for war, they enter a moral and legal quagmire. Senator Paul points out the stark contradiction. How can we justify bombing a sovereign nation, our capital, or toppling its government based on indictments for drug trafficking, while simultaneously issuing pardons to convicted figures at home? How can we treat the possession of weapons by a foreign head of state as a criminal offense warranting invasion when our own domestic laws protect gun ownership fiercely? This is not merely about hypocrisy, it is about the pretext. The danger to the president's narrative is that these arguments expose the hollowness of the justification. It suggests that the reasons given for war are not the real reasons, that they are convenient excuses to exercise power, to create leverage, and to project dominance. By stripping away these layers of justification, Senator Paul is doing something revolutionary in the current political climate. He is proving that a Republican can oppose Trump on a core issue of policy and survive. He is showing that the emperor's arguments have no clothes. This revelation breaks the spell of fear. For years, the assumption was that to cross the president was political suicide. But here's a senator, standing firm on constitutional principles, dissecting the administration's logic with surgical precision. And he is not being erased. He is not losing relevance. In fact, he is gaining it. It signals to the quiet doubters in the caucus, the institutionalists who have kept their heads down, that the water is safe, that the time for silence is over, and that the duty of Article 1 of the Constitution, the legislature, to check Article 2, the executive, is paramount. This raises a fundamental question I'd like you to consider. Is Senator Paul's argument a return to true conservatism or a dangerous retreat from global leadership? The distinction is vital, and I welcome your thoughts on where the party should stand. We saw this loss of control manifest clearly in the distraction that failed, the Greenland incident. In the midst of this brewing legislative rebellion, we witnessed a bizarre spectacle, the president's floating of the idea to purchase Greenland. On its face, it seemed like typical Trumpian theater, a grandiose, real estate-minded proposition designed to dominate the news cycle and showcase American ambition. In the past, such a maneuver would have worked perfectly. The media would have spent weeks debating the feasibility of buying an island, the base would have cheered the audacity, and the substantive legislative defeats would have been buried under the avalanche of noise. But this time, the distraction failed. And its failure is instructive. When the president made these comments, and subsequently canceled a state visit to Denmark because the prime minister described the idea as absurd, he was testing the boundaries of his influence. He was measuring whether he could still command the narrative through sheer force of personality. The result was a resounding silence from his own party. Allies recoiled. There was no rush of senators to the television cameras to defend the strategic genius of acquiring Greenland. There were no talking points circulated to justify the diplomatic rift with a NATO ally. Instead, there was embarrassment. There was fatigue. The silence from the GOP was deafening because it signaled a loss of patience with the circus. The Senate is no longer distracted by the shiny object. They are focused on the votes. They are focused on the budget. They are focused on the war powers resolution. The realization has set in that these distractions are not harmless quirks. They are symptoms of a lack of seriousness that has real diplomatic consequences. By refusing to engage with the distraction, the Senate Republicans deprived it of oxygen. They let the statement hang in the air, exposed in its absurdity, and returned to their work. This indicates a maturity, or perhaps a weariness, returning to the legislative branch. They are learning to separate the signal from the noise, and for the president, whose primary political tool is noise, this is a devastating development. However, this revolt is not limited to high-profile foreign policy disputes. It is a quiet rebellion that extends much deeper. If the war powers vote is the loud crack of thunder, the budget negotiations are the steady, eroding rain. The revolt is not limited to foreign policy. It is systemic. We must look at the power of the purse, the most fundamental authority granted to Congress, to see the true extent of the president's waning influence. The administration's budget proposals have consistently called for draconian cuts to non-defense discretionary spending, targeting institutions that are vital to the nation's scientific and environmental infrastructure. The president proposed a staggering 56% cut to the National Science Foundation. He sought to slash the budget of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, effectively defunding the eyes and ears that track our weather and climate. He called for deep reductions in basic research, the lifeblood of American innovation since the Second World War. In a functioning imperial presidency, where the party is in lockstep, these cuts would be the starting point for negotiation, and the final budget would reflect the president's priorities. But that is not what happened. Instead, we saw a quiet, bipartisan refusal. Congress did not just ignore the cuts, they reversed them. They restored funding to NOAA. They They increased the budget for basic research. They protected the National Science Foundation. And they did so with Republican votes. This is significant because it represents a rejection of the president's worldview on the administrative state. While the president rails against the deep state and seeks to hollow out these institutions, Senate Republicans, many of whom understand the value of data, research, and scientific leadership for their own states' economies, are quietly shoring them up. These votes do not generate headlines like a rally speech does. They happen in committee rooms and markup sessions. But they tell a story of political erosion. They signal that Trump can demand, but he can no longer command. The legislature is reasserting its prerogative to define the priorities of the nation. It is a reminder that while the president proposes, Congress disposes. And in this disposal of the president's budget cuts, we see a party that is beginning to differentiate its own values from the impulses of its leader. Were you aware that these budget restorations were happening with Republican support? It is a detail often lost in the noise. I welcome your observations on whether this bipartisan cooperation is a sign of health or dysfunction in our capital. This brings us to the fundamental shift in the psychology of power, the move from inevitability to liability. Ultimately, politics is a game of psychology. Power resides where men believe it resides. For 3 years, Donald Trump's power has been rooted in the perception of inevitability. The belief was that he represented the inexorable future of the Republican Party, that his grip on the voter was permanent, and that to oppose him was to stand in front of a freight train. But fear is a perishable currency. It must be constantly renewed with victories and displays of dominance. When those victories dry up, when the dominance is revealed to be bluster, the fear dissipates. And when the fear evaporates, the calculation of self-interest shifts. We are entering a season of brutal midterm math. Senators are looking at polling data in suburban districts. They are looking at the erosion of support among women and independents. They are realizing that the very factor that propelled them in the primary, total loyalty to Trump, may be the anchor that drags them down in the general election. The Trump card is losing its value. This shift is visible in the behavior of senators like Josh Hawley and Todd Young. These are not the old guard establishment types. These are younger, ambitious conservatives who represent the future of the party. When they hesitate to back the president, when they remain noncommittal on key votes, or when they openly critique administration strategy, it is kryptonite to the authoritarian style. Their hesitation proves that the fear is gone. They are calculating that their political futures may last longer than the Trump presidency, and they are positioning themselves accordingly. Furthermore, we are seeing the return of ideology. For a long time, Trumpism, a vague collection of grievances and impulses, supplanted traditional conservative ideology. But now, in the vacuum created by the president's chaotic leadership, the party is beginning to debate ideas again. The War Powers vote forces a debate on interventionism versus isolationism. The budget votes force a debate on the role of government in science and innovation. The trade wars force a debate on free markets versus protectionism. By debating ideas, the Senate is implicitly sidelining a leader who operates only on impulses. They are returning to the language of governance, a language the president does not speak fluently. To appreciate the historic magnitude of this moment, we must turn our gaze to the echo of 1973 and the cyclical nature of executive overreach. History, as the saying goes, does not repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. To view the current Senate rebellion in a vacuum is to miss the broader arc of American governance. We are witnessing a moment remarkably similar to the twilight of the Nixon era, specifically the passage of the original War Powers Resolution of 1973. That legislation was born not merely out of opposition to the Vietnam War, but out of a profound institutional exhaustion. The Congress of that era, much like the Senate of today, had grown weary of an imperial presidency that treated Article 1 of the Constitution not as a constraint, but as a nuisance to be bypassed. The parallel is instructive because it reveals the inevitability of the pendulum swing. For decades, the executive branch, under both Republican and Democratic administrations, has steadily accreted power, accumulating authorities that the framers explicitly reserved for the legislature. They have done this often with the tacit consent of a Congress happy to avoid difficult votes. But there is a breaking point. There's a moment when the accumulation of unilateral power shifts from being a convenience to being a threat. We have reached that tipping point. What makes this particular swing of the pendulum so fascinating and so perilous for Donald Trump is that it is being driven by his own party. In 1973, a Democrat-controlled Congress checked a Republican president. Today, we see Republican senators, men who have campaigned on conservative principles of strict constructionism, realizing that they can no longer reconcile their judicial philosophy with their political loyalty. They are looking in the mirror and asking if they are senators first or partisans first. And increasingly, the answer is the former. This historical context deepens the president's panic. He understands, perhaps instinctively, that once Congress reawakens its dormant powers, it does not easily go back to sleep. The genie does not return to the bottle. If the Senate successfully asserts its authority to limit military engagement in Iran or Yemen, it establishes a precedent that will shackle this president and future presidents, regardless of the news cycle. It transforms the strongman into a manager, a negotiator, a figure who must ask for permission rather than demand submission. And for a personality type built entirely on the concept of unchecked will, that is a fate worse than electoral defeat. It is a form of political castration. Furthermore, we are witnessing a profound schism within the conservative legal movement itself, a battle for the soul of the judiciary and the Constitution. For the past 40 years, the intellectual engine of the Republican Party has been the Federalist Society and the broader conservative legal movement. The guiding star of this movement has been originalism, the idea that the Constitution should be interpreted according to its original public meaning. For a long time, there was an uneasy truce between the unitary executive theorists, who believe the president has vast inherent powers, and the constitutionalists who believe in a strict separation of powers. Donald Trump managed to keep this coalition together by delivering judicial appointments, but the war powers vote has shattered that truce. We are seeing a faction of the party, led by intellectual heavyweights like Senator Mike Lee of Utah, deciding that fidelity to the text of the Constitution outweighs fidelity to the leader of the party. When Senator Lee emerges from a briefing on military action, his face red with anger, describing the administration's refusal to answer basic legal questions as insulting and un-American, he is not speaking as a never-Trumper. He is speaking as a constitutional purist who sees the administration's behavior as a betrayal of the very principles they claim to defend. This is a critical development because it strips the president of his intellectual armor. He can no longer claim to be the defender of the Constitution when the most ardent constitutional scholars in the Senate are voting against him. It creates a permission structure for other conservatives to defect. It allows them to frame their vote not as a betrayal of Trump, but as a defense of the founders. It provides a high ground sanctuary where senators can hide from the wrath of the base, saying, "I support the president, but I support the Constitution more." This schism is lethal to the president's control because it turns his own greatest achievement, the reshaping of the judiciary and the focus on the Constitution, against him. The very language of strict construction that he used to rally the base is now being used to dismantle his war powers. It is an irony of Shakespearean proportions, and it reveals that the intellectual foundations of the GOP are shifting beneath his feet. The party is moving away from a personality-based loyalty toward a structural integrity that views the presidency as a temporary office, not a permanent throne. As we peel back the layers of this revolt, we also uncover the shadow primary, the quiet, ruthless audition for the future of the Republican Party. While the cameras focus on the drama of the vote, the silence in the Senate cloakroom speaks of a different contest. We must recognize that the Senate is composed of 100 egos, many of whom look in the mirror and see a future president. For the past 3 years, the path to advancement was simple. Hug Trump as tightly as possible. But the calculus has changed. The shadow primary for 2024 and 2028 is already underway, and the candidates are positioning themselves not just as heirs to Trump, but as correctives to his excesses. Senators are beginning to realize that the Trump brand may have a shelf life. They are looking at the demographic trends, the loss of the suburbs, the alienation of educated voters, and they are crafting a new identity. This identity is Trumpism without Trump, the populist policies without the chaotic governance. By voting to restrain the president on war powers, figures like Tom Cotton or Marco Rubio or Josh Hawley can signal to the donor class and the intellectual elite that they are quote responsible. Adults, while still maintaining enough hawkish bona fides to satisfy the base. It is a delicate high-wire act, but the fact that they are attempting it at all is proof of Trump's waning influence. In a true dictatorship of the party, there is no shadow primary. There's only the leader, but here we see senators hedging their bets. They are buying insurance policies against a Trump collapse. They are differentiating their brands. When a senator refuses to defend the president on a controversial call or votes to override a veto, they are effectively placing a short sell on the president's stock. They are betting that, in 5 years, the party will reward those who showed independence more than those who showed sycophancy. This shadow primary creates a feedback loop of defiance. As one senator steps out of line and survives, and perhaps even sees a bump in their polling or fundraising, it encourages others to do the same. The herd immunity against Trump's tweets begins to build. The President-ES primary weapon, the threat of ending a career, loses its potency when the most ambitious members of the party decide that their careers are better served by establishing a distinct identity. As we look toward the future, I'm curious to hear your assessment. Which of these rising figures do you believe truly understands the constitutional gravity of the moment? The comment section is open for your analysis. Finally, we must consider the geopolitical consequences of a constrained executive and what it signals to the world. The implications of this Senate revolt ripple far beyond the Beltway. They are being read closely in Beijing, in Moscow, in Tehran, and in the capitals of our allies. For 3 years, the world has grappled with a volatile American foreign policy driven by impulse and personal relationships. The assumption among our adversaries was that the American president could do whatever he pleased, unchecked by domestic institutions. This created a dynamic of unpredictability that, while occasionally destabilizing to opponents, also eroded the reliability of American commitments. The Senate Enyaosom's reassertion of its war powers sends a powerful message to the international community. The United States is a republic of laws, not a fiefdom of one man. It signals to our allies in NATO that there are adults in the room who value stability and process. It signals to our adversaries that the American political system has self-correcting mechanisms. While the president may bluster about leaving alliances or taking unilateral military action, the legislative branch retains the capacity to pull on the reins. Some may argue that this project's weakness, that a divided government is a vulnerable one. But that is a superficial reading of democracy. In truth, it projects the resilience of the American system. It demonstrates that our institutions are strong enough to withstand even the most aggressive attempts to bypass them. It shows that the check and balance is not a dusty theory from a civics textbook, but a living, breathing, fighting reality. However, for the president personally, this is a diplomatic disaster. His ability to negotiate on the world stage is predicated on the idea that he speaks for the entire government. When the Senate openly rebukes him on foreign policy, it diminishes his standing in every negotiation room. World leaders realize they are dealing with a lame duck executive, legally and politically constrained by his own party. They will begin to wait him out. They will look past him to the Congress or to the next administration. The strongman cannot effectively negotiate when his own legislature is publicly removing the bullets from his gun. All of this leads us to the unavoidable conclusion regarding the post-Trump calculation. Friends, we must understand the why behind the panic. The president is not panicking because of a single policy loss. He is panicking because he senses the shifting of the tide. The war powers vote is a referendum on his grip. It is a stress test of his authority, and the structure is failing. The Republican establishment is doing the one thing Donald Trump fears most. They are beginning to imagine a future without him. They are looking at 2024, 2028, and beyond, and they are seeing a party that must survive after the personality cult has faded. Power does not disappear overnight. It chips away piece by piece, vote by vote, silence by silence. What we are witnessing in the Senate revolt, in the budget defiance, and in the failure of the Greenland distraction is the acceleration of that erosion. The strongman is no longer commanding the future. He is merely reacting to it. The spell of invincibility is broken. The fever is breaking. And for the first time in a long time, the United States Senate is beginning to act like the United States Senate. And so, I leave you with this final question to debate. Is the Republican Party witnessing the temporary end of an era, or the painful birth of a new constitutional conscience? I look forward to reading your insights below. Thank you for your time and your attention to these vital matters of our republic.